As Black as Resistance, Chapter 4, From Here on Out. In a capitalist society, capital is produced, circulated, accumulated, hoarded, and exchanged through a variety of complex mechanisms. These mechanisms are studied by intellectuals and critical theorists and often articulated in complicated ways that are difficult to grasp. Yet, when it comes to the examination of social movements, the influence of money is often overlooked. The existence of corporate interests, philanthropic funders, and elite capital makes co-optation both alluring and almost inevitable. This dilemma facing any burgeoning Black protest movement affects the potential for sustained grassroots political work and movement building. Over the past 3 decades, money and funding have become increasingly central to the Black-led movement against anti-Black state violence. In the eyes of liberal funders, sympathetic celebrities, and well-intentioned middle-class people, a donation is an easy way to support the cause. The energy of an uprising can thus be diluted into a mere charity endeavor. Who ultimately stands to gain from this? After Trayvon Martin was murdered and protests erupted around the country, many people looked for a way to lend support. Trayvon galvanized and became the face of a protest movement against racism and anti-Black violence that has dramatically altered U.S. political culture. Martin's image became a commodity. T-shirts, hoodies, and other items declaring justice for Trayvon proliferated, and some even saw the purchase of products like Skittles or Arizona iced tea, which Trayvon was holding when he was on his way home prior to being murdered, as acts of solidarity. The makers of Skittles and Arizona iced tea stayed mum about this, playing it safe by simply issuing condolences to the Martin family. Solidarity was also expressed through countless hashtag declarations that others too were Trayvon, that they felt anger and sorrow in the face of racial terror and vigilante violence. But these expressions, especially from non-Black people, meant little. Anti-Black violence is so pervasive because there is an unequal distribution of vulnerability and victimization, even within the Black community. Following this tragedy and countless other incidents of anti-Black violence, it became clear, if it wasn't already, that T-shirt slogans and consumption-based politics were vastly insufficient responses. Relying too heavily on these forms of protest may make people feel like they've done something, but it directs energies away from the fight for transformative change. Even boycotts, such one against the city of Cleveland following the non-indictment of the police officers who killed Tamir Rice, are far from an effective response despite their historic usefulness at times. People's attention is drawn away as they respond to yet another incident of violence elsewhere. For some time, financial interests have attempted to direct the priorities of Black protest movements and popular mobilizations. With foundation grants, however, come rules and constraints. Movements mutate into nonprofits, and activists become professionals, celebrities, and executive directors. Individuals come to represent causes that affect millions to the point that individuals' own visibility and profile rival and even eclipse the cause. Confrontational and power-contesting grassroots politics are contained, controlled, and redefined. This is the soft power of corporate capitalism, and specifically of the nonprofit industrial complex, defined by Dylan Rodriguez as a set of symbiotic relationships that link together political and financial technologies of state and owning class protectorship and surveillance over public political intercourse, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements since the mid-1970s. Though posing as humanitarian or even relatively radical in nature, this complex is inextricably linked to the anti-Black carceral system and complements it. It is through the philanthropic championing of the movement's more moderate and explicitly reformist elements, for example, anti-capitalist economic justice politics being watered down to the ideas of Black capitalism sold as economic self-determination, that liberatory and revolutionary visions are destroyed. Compromising and neutralizing political movements is inherent to the complex's very function. The logic behind, if you can't beat them, join them, is specious. Instead, it is evident that disruptive Black-led movements can be tamed with money from funders who don't truly have our best interests in mind, as well as support from political institutions. The nonprofit industrial complex and liberal power structures bind and reward the writers, activists, and so-called leaders selected on our behalf who least threaten the status quo. When movements become tax-deductible and anti-racist politics are reduced to a donate here button or t-shirt, what is there for those wielding oppressive power to really be worried about? Scholar and activist Keeanga Yamada Taylor highlights this history of funding as a method for containing Black cultural and political movements before the Civil Rights Movement. Taylor notes the way as elite funding sources frequently overdetermine the decision-making processes of Black progressive organizations. In her words, perhaps the largest issue with the foundations and funders is that these organizers also attempt to politically shape the direction of the organizations they fund. Ultimately, funders and other philanthropic organizations help to narrow the scope of organizing to changing policy and other measures within the existing system. Foundation money disciplines movements into practices of professionalization, which lead folks to emphasize and prioritize careerism and the expectation that political struggle should be externally funded. Our movements and our work need to avoid neoliberal enticements to corporatize or commoditize or otherwise become caught in the gears of capitalist accommodation. Our movements and our work need to avoid neoliberal enticements to corporatize or commoditize or otherwise become caught in the gears of capitalist accommodationism. The problems faced by oppressed people in the United States are tragedies, not an economic and political opportunity to otherwise negligent parties and organizations. What we know about the nonprofit world and the liberal approach to activism is that it can completely detract from the sincerity of movements. Petitions, donate buttons, letters, hashtags, phone calls, and marches are surely ways to raise awareness and consciousness, but when these methods are used as the primary or even sole means of combating U.S. authoritarianism, we should begin to see them as more than just counterproductive. They can foster complacency and even serve as deterrents themselves, where mere awareness, or awakening, is seen as a socio-political victory and end in itself. Liberal activism drives the creation and maintenance of what one can describe as microwavable movements, political mobilizations created to respond to problems but not actually fix them. Rather than reject capitalism, they embrace it through the murky morality of conscious consumerism, which lulls us into falsely believing that purchasing a product is a system-shifting action. Though it may make us feel better to purchase products from a company that has publicly declared that Black Lives Matter or donates a part of their proceeds to community organizations, it changes nothing. Likewise, reliance on corporate and foundational support only nurtures political dependency. It does not push Black people toward liberation and self-sufficiency. Google's nonprofit arm has donated over $32 million to racial justice organizations since 2015, but the company has notably participated in the displacement of Black communities through gentrification. This is not to suggest that donors have never played a positive role in movement building or that economic hardship is desirable for organizers. People have been increasingly using online platforms to collectivize resources or crowdfund disaster relief efforts, bail funds, and other forms of support for victims of violence or people experiencing financial hardship. But fundamentally, how does a movement protect itself from co-option by individuals and institutions eternally endowed with the structural capacity and mandate to divert political energy and direction? This question must frame of our future work and be centered in Black movement debates. We must ask ourselves in the chapter in our history in which we were bought and sold by capitalism is one we want to continue writing and living. The questions of what needs to be accomplished and how to move forward are complex. Creating priorities for people who come from a range of diverse backgrounds but share commonalities based on only certain parts of our identities, sometimes reducible only to skin color, is incredibly difficult. Territorial and sectarian bickering actively hinders our pathways to freedom. We want liberation, but finding what liberation truly entails means thoroughly interrogating the past, understanding how that past has enabled this present, and then imagining and beginning to actualize a future in meaningful material ways. That future must be increasingly absent of the things threatening us most in this present. Envisioning Black liberation is necessarily the act of creating a new world. As Black as resistance is and has been, there is far too much revolutionary history to be watered down. The United States is in for a rude awakening. A system whose contours were created and shaped through terrible brutalities can only be denounced and rejected. We must overcome the system that is in place, not only for ourselves but also for the sake of the entire world, whose fate through the globalization of capitalism is inextricably entangled with that of the United States. The nationalism-rooted logic that drives so much of today's activism is counterproductive in our movements. We cannot have notions of liberation predicated on positively reclaiming the real American values that supposedly include liberty and justice for all, and we cannot allow the state to misleadingly manipulate and exploit potentially liberatory endeavors. The country that we truly love or want to love does not exist yet, and what Black people generally articulate as a love of our country is not a love of the state. The rights that we cherish have come as a result of militant liberation work. They are a product of Black resistance and Indigenous rebellion, of colored defiance. It will surely continue to be this way because our survival has always hinged upon our people's willingness to counter the onslaught against us. What we believe and who we are is so much more than the identities imposed upon us, first by European empires and then within the U.S. nation-state. Our self-determination does not depend on the stability and continued existence of what we have been deluded into believing is a free country. Black liberation must mean the end of the United States as we understand it, because this country's existence is dependent on the production of anti-Blackness to function as it does. The central question about Black liberation is not whether our claims to freedom are legitimate. As Lorenzo Comboa Irvin says, we have the moral and political right to rebel. The questions are when and how this collective effort will happen. We must remember that material change-making need not necessarily be dramatic, and the expectation of change as solely sudden and cataclysmic is unreasonable. Building a new and innovative left should be a primary concern, but it is important to remain free from the constraints of left sectarian dogma, cults of personality, and selfish jostling to be recognized as movement leaders. We can organize humbly and horizontally and resist the stratification of more easily destructible movements past, and we do not need leaders in any classical sense. While infighting and schisms that plagued movements of the past provide useful examples to avoid, past successes also need to be examined without romanticizing them. If our only purpose is to mimic the revolutionaries of previous generations rather than to improve upon their theory and methods, then we risk repeating their errors and reproducing their harms. Some may argue that the need for a more singular and centralized movement is rooted, but we have seen how mass movements have been splintered and destroyed by the state's targeting and elimination of movement leaders. We have also seen, and continue to see, the elitism, community disconnect, and pandering to systems of power that come with individuals positioning and communicating themselves as movement leaders. Given the almost innate corruptibility of movement leadership in these ways, it is worth earnestly interrogating whether we need these conventional structures at all, and if so, how we could benefit from more horizontal and autonomous organizing. Commentary about the anarchistic nature of Blackness is not necessarily advocacy for anarchist politics or ideology. Rather, it describes a condition that might lend itself to a form of organization reflecting that tendency. Blackness itself is anarchistic as a result of Black exclusion from the social construct, and thus non-assimilation into the state. This existence and a reflexive understanding of our existence within a color-based caste system can predispose us to be more readily primed for radical politics, which include anarchistic and anti-authoritarian ideas. Why not directly challenge the authority of oppressive political institutions when our social placement primes us to do so? Anarchism is a misnomer, really, to describe a set of politics that challenges the necessity of systems and structures that we presume to be necessarily like the state itself, with hierarchical and authoritarian governance. Anarchy is not synonymous with chaos, and chaos is not an inevitability in a society that's supposed to value egalitarianism and therefore should reject the imposition of stratified social organization. The idea of creating a libertary society outside of the confines of the U.S. nation-state is so abstract that many people presume chaos. Even some Black Americans feel that our ancestors' pre-colonial existence, a non-state existence prior to the European drawing of borders, was some sort of chaos or anarchy or even a more primitive means of organization. We can attribute that much to Eurocentric revisionist history and our own internalization of that white supremacist miseducation. Any chaos attributed to African nations was largely a result not of self-organization, but of colonial plunder and exploitation. It would serve well to examine the history of trying to instill in Black people a fear of radical politics. One need only look to the history of the outside agitator as a tool for dissuading Black people from interracial coalitions and left politics. During the Civil Rights Movement, white anti-segregationists who organized voter registration drives in the South were described by conservative politicians as agitators for disrupting the relative peace of Jim Crow racism. In contemporary activism, the suggestion that Black Lives Matter or that other Black-led racial justice organizations are engineered by George Soros is a dismissive anti-Semitic insinuation that Jewish people are puppeteers funding Black organizations as a part of a so-called global takeover. The idea of Jewish communists sowing seeds of racial unrest was also part of reactionary white discourse during the Freedom Rides of 1961, which suggested Jewish outsiders were somehow responsible for manipulating and coordinating the bus rides. If or when Black people are radicalized en masse, if uprisings turn into sustained resistance against the state, the results would be or will be transformative. This is not to impose a special responsibility for Black people to actualize freedom for everyone else, as is the subtextual commentary and liberal declaration that Black women will save us, given their consistent progressive or practical voting decisions. Instead, it suggests that Black people's place in the fight against white supremacist capitalism is unique since so much of structural violence entails anti-Blackness. Failing to recognize this undermines the potential and efficacy of any widespread interracial coalition, e.g., historical groups like the Chicago-founded Rainbow Coalition, which included the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, Puerto Rican leftist groups, and the Young Patriots, an organization of white working-class leftists. Blackness is the anti-state just as the state is anti-Black. The oppression of Black people ought not to inspire the modification of this existing state or the aspiration to create a purportedly better state. Somehow, during the formation of the U.S. settler project, anti-Black violence became a nod to the supposed beauty of the empire. Since the death of Crispus Attucks, the first person killed in the Boston Massacre, and thus the first martyr of the American Revolution, Black sacrifice for the nation has been turned into a weapon against us for the benefit of the state. As opposed to recognizing Black Americans as a group of people upon whose suffering the state is constructed, we too often understand the acquisition of Black rights and the eventual inclusion, assimilation, of Black people into the social contract as a reason to continue our fight within state apparatuses. The myth of the arc of social progress flies in the face of the reality that our rights are being actively rolled back and continuously denied. Understanding the anarchistic condition of Blackness and the impossibility of its assimilation into the U.S. social contract, however, could be empowering. It is not up to us to castigate anyone who is or isn't empowered by our particular set of worldviews. We do not label anyone's philosophy right or wrong unless it reproduces or reperpetuates existing oppressions. We simply hope to observe and analyze and express our concerns, rooted in the desire to achieve liberation for all Black people around the world. As the authors of this book, we represent different aspects of Blackness in this country, one of us as a descendant of enslaved Africans and the other as a child of Zimbabwean immigrants. We came together in the hopes of fulfilling something much bigger than ourselves, to offer a framework for understanding the Black condition in the United States, and to challenge and increasingly standardize a reaction to oppression. This imperfect yet heartfelt undertaking was intimidating, given all that we know needs to be accomplished and how much we don't know about how to define completion, and arrival at the destination where we wish to go. It is impossible that a people's liberation is a perpetual project and must consistently be renewed and updated. Embracing Nina Simone's definition of freedom as the absence of fear, we strive to overcome our own fears to offer our understanding of structural violence, ways of subverting these systems, and ways to imagine new ones. For many people, the difficult and enduring questions about racial capitalism and white supremacy can be overwhelming. People may ask for answers as though there are distinct formulas for overcoming each form of systemic oppression. The truth is almost reductively simple. The solution to capitalism is anti-capitalism. The solution to white supremacy is the active rejection of it and the dual affirmation of indigenous sovereignty and Black humanity. We must reject the violent machinations of the settler state, e.g. mass incarceration, treaty violations, transmisogyny, and so on. Any solutions to the centuries of injustices and brutality waged against us requires a long struggle, and a crucial part of that struggle is precision in identifying our position as oppressed people and the structures that produce and maintain anti-Blackness. Political education that thoroughly indicts racial capitalism and its supporting system slowly increases consensus around our oppression. With this, the chances increase for effective, diverse actions necessary for liberation. Removing oppression, not reforming it, demands the creation and radicalization of new dissidents. It is an exercise in imagining new communities. Our identities will be reflected in our willingness to nurture and channel the anger, angst, dissatisfaction, and resentment felt by Black people towards institutions of injustice. Channeling collective racial trauma into world-imagining energy and analysis is one of the ways we express care for our fellow Black people and our desire to improve their conditions. Non-participation in the systems that harm us is not a choice for many of us, but we can learn to undermine them when opportunities present themselves. Meaningful steps toward liberation do not have to be dramatic. Steve Biko's assertion that the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed encourages us to create new ways of understanding oppression so that we may effectively challenge it and recreate ourselves at every opportunity. The ability to thrive as people is something beautiful, and we cannot allow ourselves to be disposed by being misused in this stale U.S. project of empire. Instead, we should be radically defining what will bring about our freedom from our unacceptable conditions. Until then, rebellion will continually bring us closer to where we should rightfully be. When the work of our struggle settles beyond the turbulent waves of our current predicament, what lies in our depths can grow as a foundation to create a world free of oppressive violence, fear, and perpetual disruption.